So we're very appreciative of your public service and your willingness to come and testify about your experience when it comes to peer review and specifically with high-speed rail.
Thank you, Senator DeSaulnier and members of the committee. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Alexis, and I am a co-founder of Californians Advocating Responsible Rail Design. Our group was founded almost 4 years ago now to provide oversight, advocate for transparency, and make sure that communities were involved in the project. I personally took a lot of interest in the ridership model. My background is in economics, and that was a fit with my skills and training. I want to talk about peer review generally a little bit to then compare and contrast that with what actually went on with the project. And also just talk about my particular interaction with the peer review panel and where I found that concerning, and then I have some final recommendations that may differ a little bit from the Caltrans ones, but I think are in line with the basic goals. The High-Speed Rail Authority has used peer review continuously throughout its existence in all sorts of different contexts. It's had it for operations. It actually has, I just found out, a geotechnical and earthquake engineering peer review panel, which no one else knew about. I did get a report from them, and that should probably go on the website, and maybe they should talk to the Caltrans committee. I won't talk about that today. I will talk about the committee, the peer review panel that was created by the legislature to review the business plans, as well the ridership model that is still, I think, deeply troubling, had 3 separate peer review efforts on it. Peer review has a very long history in validating science, and I think we need to be extremely careful when we use the word peer review, because it does convey some kind of authority and some kind of acceptability for what's been done. And I think a lot of what we call peer review is not peer review. And it doesn't meet any of the criteria or the purpose or anything along those lines. Listening to the conversation about how Caltrans has used their peer review panel, to me it's a legitimate use, but I would just call it more like an ad hoc advisory committee or a they sound like you can call them up any day and say, come out with me on the bay. Right? That's an on-call consultant, and I think that's a very important thing to have. But it's not a peer review panel, and the advice would be taken differently. It's useful advice, but it's not something you'd use to validate or to verify. It is a cornerstone in the scientific method, and it's something that it's mostly been used in science to decide what work is worthy of being considered, furthering science, what gets into the journals, what research gets funded. So there's been tremendous research into how you do research, and we know a lot of things about this. The independence of reviewers is paramount. That is the #1 top subject, and it's not something where you can simply have a disclosure. Disclosure is not enough. NIH has gone to some very strict standards now. If you have a conflict, you will not be allowed to participate except in very, very exceptional circumstances. The conflict of interest and bias, both negative and positive, taints reviews. And I want to make sure we understand and one reason why I would advocate for not just using the standard forms for peer review is the conflict of interest and bias are not just financial. It is personal relationship issues. This is something that's been proven through time. They've looked at the role of double, where they blind, usually for journals, it is blind as to you don't know who reviewed your work, but they've gone to now a double-blind system where you don't know whose work you're reviewing, because they found it had a substantial impact on what was being put forward. I take this a little personally, since women were largely, who was discriminated against when they went to blind auditions for orchestras. A woman's chance of making it into the orchestra went up by 2 to 3-fold. The same thing with various different committees. It's incredible. So I think, and one of the things they've actually found, and economists have a real interest in this, is that the more somebody doesn't think they have a conflict or they think they're not biased, the more biased they're actually likely to be. So the more the lady doth protest too much. you really have to be very careful, and it's very real. I mean, this is why in the medical industry now they've gone to not just saying you should say whether you're getting gifts, no gifts. I mean, you're moving to hospitals, you're not taking a free lunch from somebody because it's impacting what people are doing. So to deny that this exists, you know, we can say, and people have, I think, the best of intentions. I mean, I think they really, in their minds, think that they're not doing it, but it changes the tone, it changes the negativity, it changes whether you're willing to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, whether you just assume that something must be true, or whether you go and validate it. I mean, it has important consequences for outcome. Another thing is that reviewers are typically unpaid or paid just a minor honorarium. Once somebody starts to be paid substantial amounts of money, they are part of the project team. They are no longer independent. So in science, I mean, basically nobody is paid. And they still have this, you know, they'll serve on review panels, and it's just considered what you do as being a member of the academy or a member of your profession is, yes, you'll spend a day preparing, you'll spend a day traveling, 2 days traveling, and then you might get your expenses paid if you're lucky. And these are for people who are used to being paid a lot of money per hour, and they will, you know, if they're testifying in a court case or something, they would charge $600 or $700 an hour. So that is a standard in other places, and we need to think about that, because once you start paying people a substantial amount of money, they are no longer independent, and therefore you don't have peer review. You need to have protection for reviewers in the case of a negative review, and this goes back to why, you know, you have to think carefully about how you make a peer review process public. You know, this goes back to the ability to say things in a candid way, is that you don't want any one person to take the heat for something. You know, in the same way that you have sort of whistleblower protections, right? You have to really make sure that there are not serious consequences. And I saw this in the high-speed rail project when I went to try and find, you know, people in the academic world to participate and to look at the model and to do things, and they had one of two responses, which was, you know, one, I would like future consulting gigs, and if I come out negative on this project, which I think I might, right, because I've looked at it, then I'll never be hired again. Or they said, I will probably come out negative, and then they will smear me in every professional meeting, and they will have a whispering campaign, and they will say that, you know, I hate trains and I like, you know, polluting the air, and, you know, there'll be a smear campaign, and I don't want to do that. And we actually, you know, I will say that these people were absolutely correct. I mean, this is what came to pass. And so thinking about how to protect reviewers, and as I said, so one way is, you know, in the extreme case, you blind the review, you know, you blind people from who's reviewing them. You know, the second is you do think about in the deliberations phase, and I do think there should be active public participation in the review process, but there needs to be some way in which the reviewers can say things which they will not take, you know, grief for, and they can be honest about. And the final thing is, I think that, you know, one of the things that was difficult in the high-speed rail project is that the results of the ridership study were written up in a very convoluted, complicated, thousands of pages, but yet not even having some of the standard information. Now, I went to graduate school, and people, the standards were higher for somebody writing a thesis on how many, you know, angels dance on the head of a pin. You know, so there need to be standard ways that the reports and the results are presented so that somebody can easily see if something is missing, because this is the challenge of review, is you only have what you've been given. You don't know what's missing. You don't know which tests were run that you didn't see the results of. And so in order to prevent that, in academics, you've generally gone to things where you have a very standard way of presenting results. So those are things that we understand it from peer review, when, you know, where we have sort of valid peer review. It should be understood, and I think this was mentioned earlier, that it has significant limitations, and we should appreciate those and understand those. It's not a cure-all. As somebody said once, reviewers are not there at the scene of the crime. I mean, they were not there when the original mistakes were made, and to actually figure out problems, right, takes this incredible ability to connect the dots, which is easy in retrospect, but very difficult on a prospective basis. And it needs to be understood, it is not going to find fraud. It is not going to find glaring errors. Typically, it's going to be, you know, assuming that the people whose work that's been done were professionals to begin with. And so if you want to control the original work, you have to put both the onus on the person who produced it and the person who's reviewing it. It's only one part of quality control, and I think, you know, that should be understood, that this is just one piece of that. Finding true peers can be difficult. You know, this is both, I think we've seen this is actually on on both extremes. One is, to find somebody with a specialized knowledge. I was in a review for a federal review of the ridership study, and there was an economist who had been brought in, but this person's specialty was nowhere close to what this model was, and they did not have the technical knowledge. But they'll be, oh, it's an economist, it must be fine. That's not the case. On the other hand, the NIH has considered now using patients and patient organizations in the review process, understanding now that what we've called lay people actually can have an incredibly detailed knowledge and have put more time and know more details than maybe somebody who's just coming in to review it. So I think it's on both spectrum, thinking about the width of the peers. It is limited protection against the momentum of a mega project. I mean, no matter how upright and upstanding you are, if you're being told that if you say this is not okay, that you'll cost 2 million jobs and, cause global warming, and, it's very hard to stand against that. So this process has to be, you have to think about this at the beginning and understand you're just not, it's not realistic to think about something that could actually bring a halt to a project, that there is a responsibility to kicking one of these things off, because once it goes, it's probably going. Finally, I think real review, and this is not just peer review, real review needs as many eyeballs as possible, and this is what's understood now in software development, and this is why open source has become so popular. So many people are looking at something, as they say, like more eyeballs, you'll find basically all the problems. And so I think having as much transparency with the data, with the assumptions from the very start of something, this is a way to involve graduate students and things who can also have lots of time on their hands to dig deep into things. I mean, you do not want to limit this, even if you think that very few people would be interested. So on to the actual high-speed rail project. When we talk about the peer review group, the main one we discuss is one that was established by the legislature as part of the bond measure in 2008. There were a number of members appointed by various people in the government. There were 2 members who were to represent transit providers that were given statutory exemption from the incompatible offices prohibition, and I want to discuss that in a moment. And the one who's sort of been most active is Will Kempton on that. It had a role to opine on the funding plan, which was a critical step in the project, and anything else that the legislature wanted advice on. It was only established, however, after key aspects of the project were set in concrete. So again, it had limited ability to sort of stop things in motion. It was only advisory. It had no actual ability to be a stop or go. It did issue several influential reports, which I think were incredibly important, and testified to this committee on, I think, multiple occasions. One of the things that was most disturbing was after it issued a negative report at the end of last year following the business plan, and I've included just the press release from it, but there's a full 8 or 10 page, really a rant. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in public life. It was really a rant, and it was inflammatory, and it was unbelievable. So in peer review, the idea that you would attack the people who have been given a really important job and who have, they have gone out and they put their name on this. I mean, that cannot be acceptable, and there must be consequences for that. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, I was truly shocked, and I think that's something to consider. Because that really, if you want to talk about how do you encourage people to participate in these panels, if they think that they're going to have to give a positive opinion or be, subject to just, considerable personal attacks, and public, denunciations, you will not get people participating in this, and you will not get people participating in an honest manner. A couple of weeks after that, the High-Speed Rail Authority, they were going to issue another report on a separate thing that the High-Speed Rail had done. They actually delayed reporting that for several months upon the request of the High-Speed Rail Authority, who didn't want a negative report at that time. And so this is back to the independence, right? I understand why they did it, sort of, but it's not independent. So if we go back and we look at these things, I think on some levels it was independent. The participants were not paid. I think, eventually they got some of their expenses paid. Indeed, they actually didn't even have the basic setup to even, get copies made and stuff. So I do think it is important to have some kind of, offer some kind of administrative support to a group like this. But I think from that perspective, it was set up the correct way. I do think it was a problem that you had a member, that Will Kempton was both on this panel and was serving as the CEO of Okta. And this is back to the perception of bias. And so this allowed the rail authority to say that, he was conflicted and that he was just trying to get money for his agency. And I think that was a problem. And there was a reason why the legislature outlawed, has this prohibition on holding two conflicting offices. And I think it's actually a very wise one. And I think it's something that in future peer reviews, even though there is value to having the input from somebody, in these various roles, I think it should be, from an advisory standpoint, they should not be on the actual peer review committee. That's it sort of on the peer review group. I mean, I do want to just say in conclusion, I think they did contribute to the project. I think they had some, these ideas which were denounced later became critical aspects of the new revised business plan. So their advice was eventually taken. I think that they were, though, constrained by this lack of independence, ultimately. The next group is is on the ridership study. There were 3 different reviews done. So Cambridge Systematics was hired in 2005 to come up with a new model to forecast ridership. And as part of their project, they actually ran 3 peer review meetings. So, and they hired and paid the participants on this, which is back to it's clearly not independent, and they were paid. And this was, I think there were other people that were invited to come in and observe. So I wouldn't say it wasn't public. I mean, I think at that point nobody had any interest in this. But what they were asked to do was very limited. I mean, they were, okay, well, what do you think about this general approach? Yes, no. But later, the findings of these groups were used to say, well, this model is fine, it's been checked by peer review. And that was absolutely not the case, because they did not find a number of things which have come out, later on here. After the bond measure passed, all of a sudden, interest grew, including my own, in response to what I think Senator Lowenthal called the sniff test, failing the sniff test, which was that lots of people would drive to Anaheim from San Diego to take the train. The legislature hired Berkeley ITS to conduct a review of the model and asked them to answer a basic question: is the model reliable for our decision making? And this is probably the closest we have of an independent peer review of anything that happened. They were chosen actually by this committee. They were approved by the High-Speed Rail Authority. The institution was paid $36,000, but the individual participants, I don't believe, received any money for it. It was a limited, scope of review to is the model reliable. They had, I think it was a fairly healthy process where they went back and forth with the model developer. They said, we have this issue, what do you think? And they went back and forth several times. They did have to rely on the modeler's assertions. And at the end of it, they said, no, the model is not reliable. And then came one of the most extraordinary public meetings that I have ever seen, which was a high-speed rail board meeting held in Los Angeles. And this was more or less an orchestrated attack on the credibility of the University of California, who invented the field of transportation and ridership modeling. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was personally just offended. These are the professors and the people who put the work into this. I mean, these are people who are there for the public benefit, and they were insulted, and their work was derided. And so this goes back to, you have to protect your reviewers. And this should have been unacceptable, but there were absolutely no consequences for the Rail Authority of having done this. And the Rail Authority went on, of course, to then ignore all the results from the Berkeley study, which was probably not a good idea. So finally, So just ignoring it didn't make the issue go away. It didn't fix the model. So eventually, in November of 2010, the CEO proposed that the original consultant on a $1.5 million ridership model should be given a budget of $4 million to fix the model, and that the CEO would convene his own ridership peer review panel. So these were hand-selected members who would be paid large amounts of money over a series of years to sort of work on the next generation of model, because this particular model was fine for current purposes. So this review fails basically every single criteria that you would have for a peer review panel. They were told that the authority had full confidence in the ridership consultant, and that their job was simply to help them improve it for the next time. That's not a review, right? That's an advisory group. In addition, they made a critical error in that the chair of the committee is an individual named Frank Koppelman. And it turns out that Frank Koppelman had significant conflicts of interest, none of which were publicly disclosed. And I've included in your packets a Los Angeles Times article detailing these, which are, I mean, just quite extraordinary. The head developer at Cambridge Systematics had been his graduate student, and Frank Koppelman had supervised his dissertation. They had written several papers together. They were personal friends who had dinner every month or two. They had, as a matter of fact, the Cambridge Systematics consultant had recently hired Frank Koppelman on a couple of projects and paid him thousands of dollars for work that he had done for him. In addition, they had just given a joint presentation. This is about as conflicted a relationship as you can get. Under NIH standards and any standards, somebody like this would never have been allowed to participate in a panel like this, much less chair it. You know, Dr. Koppelman, said that this did not affect his judgment. I would just say, from my personal interaction, I saw that it did. In my opinion, it affected the review. And the last page, on the second page of my testimony, I have the amounts that they were actually paid. Over between March 31st of last year and June 30th of this year, Frank Koppelman, just for his work on the peer review panel, received $231,000. Is being compensated at a billing rate of $400 an hour. So, and his work is, 3 or 4 times as many hours as any of the other panelists. So this panel is critically relying on somebody whose objectivity, is subject to question. I mean, it is just incredible. So there's nothing independent about it, and I would not call it peer review. I mean, I do think they have done I think there are aspects of the work which I think are very good. I think they have made some good suggestions which had the impact of lowering the ridership forecasts. At the end of the day, and I just saw the latest reports which mysteriously appeared on the website 2 days ago after not having been put up for a long time, that basically they've adopted most of the Berkeley recommendations and most of the recommendations that we've had for the next generation model, because, again, right, we don't really need the answer to whether this thing will make money for another 2 years after the concrete has been laid. So, I mean, I do want to talk a little bit more about, just how extraordinary this process was. So I'd worked on this model for years. There's been various levels of engagement on this. I actually put together a 16-page detailed memo of everything that I knew was wrong with the model and submitted this to the peer review panel. And this was after having asked on multiple occasions to have the opportunity to go to the peer review panel and present to them. Because I knew where at this point I knew where the bodies were buried, and nobody had taken me up on this. So I submitted to them a very, very lengthy, detailed report. Well, 3 months later, and this is really to the credit of one of the board members, Mike Rossi, put together a session on one topic, which we had issued an additional report about, the price of gas in the model. Put together a meeting, which was a great meeting, which was myself, another colleague, Frank Koppelman, the consultants, and Mr. Rossi. And we sat in a room, and I was able to ask